Hello and welcome to a special edition of the DX Mentor Next Gen Internet Usage for Ham Radio. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill, AJP, the DX Mentor. Our guests are DX gurus that we can all learn from. Each episode can also be listened to in podcast format. Just search the DX Mentor in your favorite podcast app. Also, an episode schedule and more information can be found at ajb.com/the-dx-mentor-podcast. Our gurus for this day are Joe, W-A-G-E-X, and our special guest is Eric, 4Z1UG. Eric is one of the innovators and risk takers in our hobby. He's pushing the envelope with his QSO Today virtual Ham Expo. This is literally an amateur radio exposition behind a single pane of glass. It is absolutely fascinating how Eric's brought various parts of technology together to provide an online experience that's second to none. Eric's initial foray into new technologies was the launch of his QSO Today podcast, where he interviews ham radio operators. He recently just finished number 441. That is quite a feat to be doing this for several years. Frankly, my favorite episode is number 319. You need to check that one out. How does this tie into the DX Mentor? Well, the way I see it is this. Oh, wait a minute. You're just going to have to listen to find out. Good morning, afternoon, depending on where you're at, and welcome to the DX Mentor podcast. This is a special episode, and boy, we're so darn excited to be here this morning with a really special guest. We have Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, who is perhaps his voice and call are more well-known than he is, perhaps, but he is certainly a popular voice on the internet as the QSO Today and the Virtual Expo person. And I've talked to Eric a couple times, but never this formally and in this way. So again, Eric, I appreciate you making time for us. And I'm really excited. I think we have something to talk about. This is not I don't think this is a deviation from our normal find them, work them, and confirm them attitude with the DX Mentor, because there's a lot of information that Eric can share with us and from the QSO Today podcast that an aspiring DXer can learn. And I think it's a really important point, a part of your toolbox. Joe and I have been talking about the DX Edge and some of the other really neat tools that are out there, how to use the internet, and using Eric's back catalog and of course the guests going forward, I think should be a part of everyone's repertoire, and I encourage you to take that challenge if you haven't already done that. So just to bring everyone up to date, we're in the middle of a two-part podcast on the most effective way to use social media to promote your club event or your club. The first one has already dropped on the podcast version, and I've gotten several really good emails about it, so I know there's some interest. I can't wait for the second part. And this is just going to do nothing but augment and help us build how you can learn DXing from the internet. So I couldn't be more excited. And so both of you, thank you for allowing me to steal some of your time. I'd like to start, Eric, if you would just give us a few seconds or a minute on the non-QSO Today, Eric. How did you get started, and what are the things you like to do in ham radio?
Well, sure, absolutely. I was smitten by electronics in the 60s when I was in elementary school. I did all of the things that every ham that I've interviewed, now 441 hams, I did everything that they did when they were young kids. I pushed things into electric sockets that shouldn't go there. So I learned about the byte. I had electric motors, I had erector sets. I was smitten with electronics. And then I had a neighbor that came over one night. I tell this in the QSO Today podcast, perhaps in the early days of the podcast, that in Southern California in the 60s, everybody was in their garage at night working on some project. So if you were a woodworker, you had your wood shop open and the garage door was open on the street. There was a guy that was rebuilding an airplane in his garage that I flew in at some point. Parents were different in those days. They had no problems putting their child on someone else's airplane that they'd finished in the garage and to go for a $100 hamburger. My father was into cars, and in those days, as a person before the age of 10, I was holding the light a lot, so that he could see the brakes, he could see whatever it was he was working on. So I have a lot of hands-on experience holding the light, working on projects. So one night where I'm holding the light, and a new neighbor comes in and wants to borrow a socket set, and of course my dad had the entire Craftsman cabinet full of tools. And so he loans this guy, his name was Gary Parks. He loans Gary the socket set. And I said, well, what are you building? And he says, well, I'm putting in a Heathkit garage door opener. Well, in the 60s, nobody had a garage door opener. And to a 10-year-old kid, that was like, well, that's magic. You push a button, it opens the door. So, so I followed him home, and we lived in a condominium complex. So he was actually connected to the building that we were in. And sure enough, he had a garage door opener. But what was more interesting is he had a 40-meter loading coil on the back of his car. And I said, ooh, what is that? And he said, oh, well, I'm a ham radio operator. And he had a Tempo 1, which I think was made by Yaesu in those days, but it was private labeled by Henry Radio. He had a Tempo 1 on the front seat of the car. And I said, ooh, what is that? And he says, oh, well, that's ham radio. So Gary, K6 Uniform India Mike, was my first mentor. And that's what lit the bug to ham radio. I wasn't licensed until I was living in El Cajon, or I was actually living in La Mesa, California, in the San Diego area, and a member of the El Cajon Amateur Radio Club. And I became a novice in 1973, WN6 VHV. I became a general the year later, WA6 VHV. It was a horrific call for all sorts of reasons. And I ended up getting WA6 IGR because I applied for a secondary remote control license. So in those days, if you had a remote control station, and I was also smitten by remote control stations and turning things on and off remotely. And so I got WA6 IGR, and when at a certain point I had to surrender one of the calls because the secondary station license was no longer required, I kept the WA6 IGR, which I like on CW much better than I do the VHV call. So that's kind of how I got started. I was inactive probably for 25 years. I always had radios. I always kept my license going. I had radios in the car, but I rarely turned them on during the period that I was raising my sons, with my wife in Denver, Colorado. I've since moved to Israel. I've been here 22 years. And about 12, 13 years ago, I decided to see what was actually happening in amateur radio. So I came back in. I was like Rip Van Winkle. I've said this before, is that a lot of things changed in the years I wasn't active and I wasn't paying attention. The hobby, I say this often, the hobby is now like it used to be, the circus tent with the 3 rings. It was DX, rag chewing, and contesting. Now it has those 3 rings, but the midway is 1,000 tents of all kinds of things that are ham radio. 3D printing is ham radio because we're doing it for ham radio. So the skill sets that we've acquired and added to our ham radio toolbox is immeasurable in my opinion, and the internet has only done to increase that exponentially. We publish at the speed of light. We iterate now at the speed of light, when it used to take almost a year using magazines as a way to share ham radio knowledge. That's my story in a nutshell. I live in a community called Efrat. It's about 8 miles south of the old city of Jerusalem. There's about 15,000 souls that live in this little town. We say Efrat is a great place to live, and besides, it's close to Israel. But it's a wonderful place to live. I'm up about 3,000 feet on the top of a hill, along with the rest of the community. And I have 6 grandchildren in Jerusalem that I see every week. So life couldn't be better. I have my ham radio station to my left here. I have a huge workshop. My wife gave me an apartment that's under our house. So I Actually, the kitchen is my workshop. The living room is my podcast studio and ham radio station. And as long as my stuff doesn't find its way upstairs, she's a very happy spouse. And I'm very happy to have the cave that I have. And I'm quite grateful for that.
Well, good. And you're also a recent graduate of CW Academy?
And I'm not a graduate of CW Academy. I did one course there. Okay. It is CW Academy is one of the amazing ham radio resources that if a ham has any interest in CW, I like CW because it's not talking, and I love talking. I love listening to talking, but at a certain point, CW is easier on the brain. At a certain point, you just feel like you just need to listen to CW.
Okay, we're going to have an upcoming episode with K6RB and some of the CW ops guy, and I'm really looking forward to that as well. So the other person this morning is Joe, WAGEX. Joe, I know you do this every other week, but tell us about yourself.
Well, where do I start? I started sort of like Eric in grade school. I'd come home every night, turn the receiver on, listen around. I finally got my technician license in 1970. And from there, I was on 6 meters, and we had a 6 meter opening to the Caribbean. And I just absolutely fell in love with DXing. It was just amazing to me that I could talk to these individuals in the Caribbean. So then I upgraded all over the years, been on many D expeditions, some just by myself, quite a few with big D expeditions with 15 to 20 individuals. So I just always been a DXer all my life. Thank God my darling wife, Janet, WHCAA, is also involved. And so between us, we make a good ham radio family, Bill.
And I mentioned to Eric, one of the passions you have is 60 meters.
Oh my God. Yes, I love 60 meters. I know Eric's been on me a couple of times, I guess, to do a podcast with him, which we need to do, I guess. But yeah, 60 meters is has always intrigued me. It's a tough little band. And so there's a big story behind 60 meters. Maybe sometime Eric and I can discuss.
Well, I must say the reason that Joe keeps turning me down is because he says he's not worthy.
Yes.
And I it's so laughable because I think I've done 441 episodes, and half of the people I've interviewed reply to me that they're not worthy. And but everybody has a great story, Joe, and I'm so excited at some point to hear your story.
Yeah, thank you.
And that will make you worthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works the other way. You have to go through the QSO Today, then you become worthy. That's one of the best stories I've heard on one of the podcasts, though, was from one of our other members, K4ZLE, Jay. And he told a story about he and his wife reciting, did they recite their wedding vows in Morse code, or there was something about their wedding vows in Morse code, I remember. And knowing Jay, that didn't surprise me at all. So
yes, yeah, exactly.
So I want to make sure, I want to be clear about how I think the DX podcast, the DX Mentor podcast and the QSO Today podcast kind of merge, and how our listeners and any young aspiring DXer can learn a lot from the podcast. So I compiled a little list of some of the folks that have been on the podcast, the QSO Today podcast. And as I went down the list, it absolutely it stunned me at all these guys I've met either at the DX forum or at the DX dinner or through interviews for our DX newsletter. And Joe, you'll recognize a few of these guys, N6HC, W0GJ, K0MD, K4ZLE, W1JR, N0AX, K3LR, K9LA, N6PSE, I know you know Paul, N7NG, K4RO, K9CT, K9EID, N1DJ, K4UEE, AA7A. Ned was a guest, and K0MD Scott were our first guests, right, when we kicked this off. NC0B, Rob Sherwood, who's going to be our guest tonight at our DX meeting. W3LPL, W2VU, K6RB, I mentioned, 4Z4DX. I met that rascal, so I know he's on there. K1ZZ, W8HC, I'm almost done. And NW7US, CE3CT, WB2REM, who you worked this morning on the Galapagos, most likely. W3UR, K0IR, W8TN, K8ZT, AC4BT, N6TR, KY7M, and yours truly. So it's quite excluding myself, it's quite a list of guys who have done major DXpeditions or been involved in DX in a major way. And I would encourage anyone who is an aspiring DXer, has an it to go back and listen to these podcasts, because one thing we can't relay to our listeners is the tenacity and the curiosity it takes to be a big time DXer. And every time you listen to any one of these folks, that's what you hear, is they had this burning desire to learn something different, something caught their interest, and they jumped in and off they went. So with that and that's not all of them, that's just the ones I know. But in that subset, Eric, what do you think? What do you think they kind of all have in common, maybe, that leans them more toward DX than other attributes?
I think that probably almost all of them were shortwave listeners before they started, before they got their ham radio tickets. So they were already, the idea of hearing signals from other countries intrigued them. My sense is, and again, the problem with 441 podcasts, Bill, is like their great-grandchildren. They're not your grandchildren, they're your great-grandchildren. In Israel, I have a family member here that has over 200 offspring. So, he's now in his late 80s, so he has over 200 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And if you asked him what he knows about the great-grandchildren, he kind of knows a little bit, but he doesn't know a lot. And so these podcasts for me are like great-grandchildren, is that they all ring a bell. And so I can give you some common themes. I believe that the majority of the DXers were shortwave listeners. They were intrigued by that. I think that one of the things that they did as part of their regular life is they always set aside time for ham radio and working DX, meaning it wasn't, I think I'm going to work DX today. It's like what Joe gets up every morning during the gray line, and he makes a regular effort to find DX. And I think that the most successful hams, whether they're DXers or they're contesters or they're workshop build, I'm a workshop builder, the most successful hams are the ones who put it on their calendar. It's part of their regular daily ritual is to get on the air and do the, do whatever it is in ham radio that they like to do. And it's because of that dedication and that daily dedication, that's what makes a difference. And that's what makes a successful ham radio operator. I'm also reminded the late Rabbi Sachs from the UK, he writes that he doesn't write anymore, but he wrote so much. He was so prolific that his stuff is still being published every week in Israel. And he wrote this last week that the most successful human beings, whether they're writers or they're inventors or they're musicians, they take time out every single day at the same time every day. It's part of their ritual, daily ritual. And that's what makes them not just successful, it makes them mega successful. So I think that the mega successful DXers are the ones who make that time every day.
It sounds like what you've been preaching, Joe. Get up, you get up, you work the gray line, you do some stuff around the house, you take your nap, you're back up for that gray line in the evening, and then and it's consistent, it's work for you.
Yeah. Eric, that hits me right to a T. Oh my God, yes. Yes, that's me 100%.
So Joe,
I can make generalities.
Well, Joe went through a period where he was working him and not really tracking him, so to speak. And over the last, say, year or so, he's decided maybe I should start looking at awards and stuff. And he's on honor roll on a couple of bands and worked all zone on every band. I mean, just it's funny because I scratch away all the time, and Joe has this huge buildup of QSOs, and then he decides to turn it into awards. So one thing I'm curious about, what kind of gave you the idea of the QSO Today? I mean, I can't imagine you sat around and said, I got a whole bunch of time on my hands.
Well, no, one of the things that I tell people is living in Israel, I've never worked so hard in my entire life. Everything is more expensive here. It's a great, it's a wonderful place to live, but it's as expensive as New York City. The cost of everything is high. So I'm working all the time. My wife's working all the time. I help the grandchildren. That's also part of the thing. So I don't necessarily have the time. But when I got back into ham radio, I started listening to podcasts. And I think that Ham Nation started. And there were some other podcasts, but there wasn't anybody that were talking to hams directly, that, to get the history. So, and I'm a failed engineer. I couldn't do differential equations to save my life. So I actually have a history degree from the University of California. And so I figured, let's do a podcast where we interview hams for their ham radio history. And so that's kind of how it started in 2014. I dedicated myself to do it every single week. So there are only, maybe 5 or 6 weeks in the history of the podcast that I've missed, and it's usually around the expo, the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo weekends. But even then, I try to put something up. If I don't have a guest, now I've got so much old content that I can actually put somebody up, from 6 years ago, and it plays well. I'm able to remaster the audio in many places. I just did one with a guest. We see, which one was it? Oh, with Bob Whitty, K0NR, where I went through and redubbed all of my side of the audio because the audio was so bad. So I would listen in one ear what I was asking, and I would ask it like an voice actor the same way into a new recording, and then I edited that in so that essentially it would be a high quality recording of the original interview. So I'm doing that. I do that if I can, if I'm short on content, but I usually try to stay ahead of it. But that's really how it started. I was hungry for ham radio history, and there wasn't anything that was out there yet.
Did you, and this might be a silly question, but back then, did you think, boy, this will be really cool in 2023 and it'll keep going, or did you just take it as a...
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's a combination of love for this. I think I say this all the time. I've been a ham this year, actually this month, 50 years. And I think I've learned more in the last 7-8 years about ham radio than I did in the previous 43 years from these interviews. Because essentially I ask questions that I'm interested in, so I do the research, but we often go off on tangents now because I'm interested in also not only the technology, but the impact that direction that ham took, that impact it had on he and his family and the people around him. So the podcasts seem to be getting a little bit longer. They used to run 55 minutes. Now they can run an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending upon the conversation. People may abandon. You'll have to look at the stats and see if people are jumping off at a certain point. But I find the conversations fascinating. So I'm now doing it for the love of conversation and understanding the guest.
If you get to the length of the ham radio workbench, maybe you went a little bit too far.
Oh, I love it's one of my favorite podcasts, the Ham Radio Workbench. I love the banter. And I'll tell you something, for your audience, it's the stuff that gets dropped in the middle that can end up being the most interesting in terms of, well, I never thought about that before. So the workbench has been talking recently about how to put a workbench in different kinds of scenarios. So, Thomas, K4SWL, lives in a tiny place, and he needs a Murphy workbench, like a Murphy bed. It goes up against the wall. And so all of a sudden that, I don't need a Murphy workbench, but, for a brain like mine, it's kind of like it has the time of its life. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, how would you do that? How would you do that with test equipment? I have test equipment that's 2 feet deep. I have an HP service monitor that I use to work on radios that, weighs 60 pounds. Where would I put that? So it's the little subtleties that people are saying, well, I'm working on this, but, it doesn't seem so important. Well, actually, that's the thing that ends up being the most important. So when you're doing your podcast and you're talking to your guests about DX, it could be, something they make some comment about what we pack before we go. I spoke to one of the guys that was headed off to Beauvais Island, and you think about, well, what are you taking, to Beauvais Island? I mean, it's a mound of ice, and you're going to be on it for 2 weeks or 10 days or whatever. What are you packing? What is your wife telling you should pack that you're resisting? Those end up being, really important things, so that if you ever have the opportunity to do something like that, then it's in the back of your mind that, well, maybe I should have brought that first aid kit, or I should have brought that Imodium, or I should have brought that, whatever it is. I see Joe is nodding, right? Because he knows that these are also important things.
So Joe, something there clearly piqued your interest. I know you get a lot of questions for the different expeditions you put together and either help lead, or sometimes you were the head of funding, sometimes you were the head of logistics. So what kind of resonated there?
Well, Eric's 100% right. I've always been very much into details, Eric, and the Imodium, there's a story behind that when I was in Grenada, so we don't have to get into that today. But getting into those details on a DXpedition is very, very important. I'm just very detailed orientated, so I go along with that conversation.
So, well, if you've gone to Beauvais and you've spent a month getting there, right?
Yes.
And you arrive on the island and you're missing that adapter. It's kind of like, there's no excuse for that on the one hand, but we're human beings, and so we have flaws, and we you're missing the Imodium, or you're missing the Keflex. So you now have something that you need a broad spectrum antibiotic because you just ate something that was too old or whatever, and now you're right on the edge of being sick. But if you have it, then you've saved the day. So I'm just saying that all of these conversations, even if you ask the dumbest question, they can lead to some very enlightening stuff that wouldn't have been ferreted out otherwise. So that's kind of what I try to do in my conversations now. I think I've done it long enough that I do prepare for all of the interviews, but I like to listen and see where it's going or where the guest wants to lead it, and then come up with new questions along the way.
Talking about details, Eric, when I was on Midway years ago, there was 15 of us, had a nice crew. Some of them that Bill had already mentioned earlier was on that team. But anyway, we're putting all the everything together. We get to Midway, and we're stretching out the coax for all the antennas, and we had no barrel connectors, not a one. So we had two fellows that had to come on a flight the next day, and they were in Honolulu. So we called them and told them to go to every Radio Shack in Honolulu and buy every barrel connector that they could find. So that was a blessing that those two guys, because we would have been in a world of hurt.
Wow.
Well, we would have had to strip the coax back and just twist it together, try to make something like that work. But we could not believe as much details as we went through to where we missed getting a bag of connectors, barrel connectors.
That would have been.
Well, it always means that you should stage the entire operation, find a football field or something like that, and actually stage the entire, set up the tent, set up all of the gear, just like you would on that distant island, so that that you've got all those pieces, and then you pack it up from there, rather than say, oh, here's my checklist. The checklist is good, but the checklist should be used as you're setting it up for the staging.
Yes.
One of the things I always like to, and Joe has talked to me about this, and what we don't consider, those sitting here working these guys in these harsh conditions, is the effect it has after. So Joe has said many times, actually his wife has said, since he's never been the same since he was on that island. It was 92 at night. It was 123 during the day, every day for 10 or 12 days. And you've said that, right? You've never been the same.
Yes. Yeah, my wife said that when we came off of Swain's, Craig Thompson, K9CT, and I were the co-leaders on that. And we had guys get sick there and hurt there. And when I came back, my wife would tell you today that I have never been the same. I've never been right mentally to begin with, but it never got any better.
Is it a positive thing? I mean, it seems that these DXpeditions are also opportunities for growth. So I mean, you've experienced something amazing. It might have been difficult, but you survived it. Would you say that was also a positive thing that when you came back?
Well, no, I just never have really felt right physically, Eric, and I'm always cold, even in the summertime, I'll wear a jacket. And of course, I'm 80 years old, and I think every person that you talk to that's elder seems to be cold.
Well, I'm married to someone who's always cold, so that's
yeah.
So the one question I always am intrigued with that you ask your guests is, what's the biggest threat to ham radio? And we're deviating a little bit, but so I guess what is personally, how do you see it? What's the biggest threat?
I've kind of evolved over the last year or so that I'm not so concerned about kids not getting into the hobby. Would it be nice to have kids getting into the hobby? Yes. I think that unfortunately the kids of today have some challenges which are they're not insurmountable, but they require some steady hands that at this point that may not be we may not have the ability to handle that. So I'm happy with kids that are 30 to 40 years old that are coming in. We're living long enough now in this era that someone coming in, at age 35 could be a ham for, 40, 50 years, maybe, if they take care of themselves. So I think the greatest threat to amateur radio is corporate interest in our frequencies and our not banging our drum loud enough everywhere. What the value of ham radio is, using this international park of spectrum that we are the curators of, and what the value that plays to the larger society and to the world. Now, I might be, over blowing it up in my brain in terms of what the importance of ham radio is, but all you have to do is look at every technology in the last 60, 70 years. Ham radio operators have played a major part in that development, in that iteration, in the fine tuning of that. Amateur radio, I think, has made the world a better place in terms of the problems that we've been able to tackle as a result of doing the hobby. I don't think there's a hobby like it that is as broad spectrum as ham radio. But I think that we are our national park is the territory for big business to take it over and not even use it. We lost, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, we lost 2 megs of the 220 spectrum to UPS, who's never used it. So we need to, I think we need to use every bit of spectrum that we have, and I think we need to talk to people about the fact that we are using it and what the benefit of that use is. And I don't think that we make our case. If people come up to me, and I just had somebody, we have there was a holiday of Purim here, where we read the story of Esther, and we dress in costume and we make merry. This is the month of Adar in the Hebrew calendar. We're celebrating the entire month. So I have 21 people in my house for lunch a couple days ago, and I said, "Do you want to see my man cave?" And so I brought mostly the males downstairs to see my workshop and a ham radio station and everything. And the look of puzzlement on people's faces, like, ham radio, do people still do? My father used to have a CB radio 50 years ago. We shouldn't get that. We should be right in front of everybody what we're doing. This Beauvais Island DXpedition, as absurd as it may sound to people that are not ham radio operators, this is a major undertaking. And why doesn't the general public know it? The issue of weather balloons or balloons, amateur radio balloons, being shot down with $500,000 missiles over the north of the American continent. People don't know that there's. I've looked up these numbers because I'm speaking. I'm running a forum at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in 2 weeks on amateur radio ballooning, amateur radio aeronautical mobile. Do people know that there's 2,500 balloons launched every single day in the world that are in the atmosphere? 2,500 balloons. Nobody knows this. Well,
No.
Why don't they know this? Why doesn't NORAD know this? Well, now they do know it, but why don't people talk to each other? I think that's the danger to ham radio is that we're not talking enough. People shouldn't be asking me about ham radio. We're bigger and better than ever. We've never been this good, and yet nobody knows about us. That's what I think the threat is.
Joe and I have talked.
You wanted a short answer.
No, and I guess there's a huge point we agree with because, in the community, the ham community, there's a little bit of debate over FT8, and what I think gets lost in the debate is, look at the guy and the team that developed that. You're talking about, Nobel laureates, and we have those all through the hobby that are doing these amazing things, and maybe we just get used to it, but I do think it's important because you also asked a question that I normally tie together, but you asked one at the beginning and one at the end. And at the beginning, you always asked, did ham radio help you in your choice of career, et cetera? And you've had this whole spectrum of guys that have all had these great accomplishments in their life, right? I think I've never heard anybody in your podcast say, yeah, I pretty much sit around and don't do anything and get on the air. I mean, all of them have made contributions somehow, and it's all because early on they got some interest, and ham radio helped make their decisions. So now at the end, we're kind of sitting around saying, what's your threat? What do you see as a threat? And they have this body of experience they can draw on because of ham radio early on. So I always like to tie those two questions together when I listen to a podcast, and I think, okay, I can see how Ned got there because he had this interest here and shocked himself on a toaster when he was 5, and then he wanted to find out, how did I shock myself on the toaster, and he started drilling down at it, and the majority seem to have parents that support them, but there's a lot of other guys who, well, I kind of had to do this on my own. So to me it's a fascinating study, for lack of a better term, on just when these people come on, how they talk about it, how they got there, and where they're going. It's really, really interesting. So,
well, look, I have to admit, I cherry pick. I'm cherry picking the hams I'm interviewing. I'm going through QRZ. I'm looking at people's bios if they get thrown. I look at the forums, the way people are either they're using their expertise, or they're shaming somebody or something like that. I look at a lot of things in order to come up with my list of call signs that I use to cherry pick the guests on the QSO Today podcast. The ham radio community is a cross section of the general community. So it has its space cadets, and it has its. I'm trying to think of the term they used to use on the radio, but it has everybody. Everybody can get a license now. Well, everybody could get a license then. At 80 meters was just as bad, 50 years ago as it in terms of the competitions for frequencies and all this other stuff, as it is now. So things don't change necessarily, and but I'm very lucky that the people that I cherry pick for the QSO Today podcast, I sent out lots of invitations, and maybe only 5 to 10% of those invitations are replied to, and probably only half of those become guests on the QSO Today podcast. It's an ongoing effort. You'd think that with 800,000 licensees in America, just in America, that it would be easier. It's not easy. So admittedly, if you're listening to the QSO Today podcast, you're listening to the top ham radio operators.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a completely different tact here, but I want to see, Joe, did you have any other comments or questions before I kind of take us down a different rabbit hole?
No, I don't think so, Bill. Let's get in the car and let's go.
Okay. Well, I know one comment you've made so many times is, and I consider you to be one of the more experienced DXers I know, but I don't think there's been a podcast yet where you didn't come away saying, boy, I didn't know that. So yes. And what's exciting to me is that if you come away with that, then I know that, and I learn tons of stuff every time. So, and I think that's exciting here. So Eric, the direction I'd like to take now, one of the things I have absolutely got to give you credit for innovation and courage is the whole expo idea. I think it's a fantastic idea. It's building a body of technical stuff that people can go look at. How wire and I mean, I can't imagine a topic you haven't at least had one speaker talk on. So I guess there's kind of two questions I have. How did you get there? And then let's talk about the next one.
Okay. Well, I got there as I become active, with the QSO Today podcast. Admittedly, the QSO Today enterprise is a business because I'm an entrepreneur. I've always owned businesses. I actually set up QSO Today. It has a company in America called KEG Enterprises. That's our initials, and KEG is essentially a corporate shell that actually holds QSO Today. So I run it like a business. So I try to use the proceeds to reinvest in the podcast. I try to use the proceeds to go to amateur radio events, if I can afford to. I try to be very generous supporting amateur radio systems and causes, and I subscribe to every amateur radio magazine or newsletter and pay for those from KEG as a way to support those efforts, because I think that the way that you show support for someone's effort is that you help them monetarily. So all of those people that have supported the QSO Today podcast should know that I use their money to support other people's podcasts and ham radio efforts to get the word out, because I think that's important. So having said that, I was ready to go to, in 2000, I was ready to go to Dayton, because I'd gone to Dayton a couple of years before. All of the stars lined up in terms of there were no holidays in the middle of the Dayton time. I have to be very careful in the month of May in terms of what weekends to choose. So I was all ready to go to Dayton in 2020. and then the pandemic hit. And so, we're watching, and I'm sure Bill and Joe, you were doing the same thing. Let's see what's going to be open. Is Friedrichshafen going to be open? So all of a sudden you start seeing them drop. Now, if you're following ham radio events just in the United States, there's something more than one thing every single weekend of the year. There's a contest, there's a ham, there's a convention, there's a state convention, there's a local convention, there's a ham fest. There is something every single weekend. And what we saw in 2020 was everything was being closed. Everything was being closed. There was nothing happening. So I was starting, I was talking to my wife and I'm saying, geez, I don't know what's going to happen. She says, well, what do you think you could do about it? It's like a challenge. What do you think you could do about it? And I got this idea. I said, maybe we could do a virtual convention that looks like a real convention. And so I started going on the internet looking for virtual convention platforms. And because everything was closing, not just in ham radio, but everything across the world, these companies that were doing these virtual convention platforms were all of a sudden taking off. In fact, the company I use, VFairs, they said, we're only going to talk to people that write contract in the subject line. So, and I couldn't get anybody to talk to me. I looked at maybe 8 to 10 companies and I couldn't get anybody to reply to me. So I wrote contract in the subject line, and they replied, and that's how I actually started using their platform. So the idea was, okay, I've got a platform. What's next? Well, we need speakers. So I called George, KJ6VU, and I said, George, if you were going to get speakers, how many would you get for a convention, and who would you get? And he said, well, I think, I don't know, I think 40, 50, 60. So I think probably for that first convention, we had over 60 speakers, presenters. So I sent invitations. I started hiring people around me to help me do stuff because it became overwhelming very quickly. And we did the first QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in August of 2020. And it was, and we had lots of vendors. Like everybody thought that, it was going to be, and I did too. I thought it was going to be a vending machine for money for ham radio equipment sellers because, there was nothing else going. For those that actually understood what virtual meant, and I kept saying it, virtual means that you still have to answer your phone. You still have to take an order. For those people, they did very well. Flex Radio did very well. Elecraft did very well. There were other companies that didn't do so well because they didn't think they needed to dedicate the personnel or the time or the whatever. They thought, it was just people would just go to their website and order stuff online, and that would be it. So, so the first event was amazing. It was a free ticket. 25,000 people came on the platform. VFairs was able to handle the loading. That was really important. We actually went out and talked to companies that handle buffering data in the local areas to make sure that we could actually handle the loading for all of those people on the same platform at the same time. It went off very well, and then in the history of it, I did it 6 months later in March, and I blew it all to hell. And I was trying to integrate two platforms, a platform called AirMeet and the VFairs platform, and the transition didn't work well. And my programmer was intubated that weekend in the hospital with COVID-19 in Algeria, and so it couldn't have been worse. But people were forgiving, and they gave me a chance to do another one by not asking for all their money back. So so I've done 5 now. I'm coming up on the 6th one, March 25th and 26th UDT. We actually start Pacific Standard Time at 6 p.m. Friday. So Friday on the 24th of March at 6 p.m. PDT, because I think we're going into daylight savings time next week. PDT, then we'll have the Ham Radio Workbench podcast guys doing their live show, and they can do it for 3 hours if they want, and we've given them the space. And then Rat Pack will do their thing also, in the same time slot. And then all the presentations start. The first presentation will be at 8 o'clock. It will be a presentation with me and Anthony Lesgree. And we're actually going to kick off the day with that presentation in terms of the goal of this expo was new ham radio license, now what? That doesn't mean it's just for new ham radio licensees. It could be for people who've had a license who are returning. And it's for people like you guys who have a lot of experience that like to talk to people about ham radio. What could they learn? How can I mentor you? And I've deliberately created a much simpler VFairs presentation, meaning that the primary focus of the expo is around tables. The tables are back. VFairs has created the tables like they were in AirMeet on their platform using embedded technology that works extremely well, and the presentation. So if you're not in presentations, you can be in the roundtable lounge, which is all one big place. Flex Radio has 2 large tables with 16 chairs. The chair size changes. Rack Pack has a table with 20 chairs. Workbench Podcast has a round table with 20 chairs. There'll be tables by subject. There'll be tables that are just numbered. So if you meet a friend at one of the tables that you haven't seen, like I did a couple of years ago, that I haven't seen in 50 years, you can say, oh, go to table number 26. Let's go sit there and I'll drink coffee and you drink coffee and we'll just have a conversation. I love the tables. I hope I'm not the only one, but it makes such a great virtual experience to be able to see who's in the chairs. You don't have to join the table to see who's sitting there. Before you sit down, you can find your group. You can make a group. So I'm very excited about what's happening. I'm happy to show you if you want what those tables look like.
I was going to ask if we can do that in a minute. And for those of you, of course, we're on a podcast format also, but for those of you that have not seen this, I mean, it is literally, and so I used to do a road show with Hewlett Packard. And I got to tell you, you get to a point where you hate these things because you're just standing around. And so every time I go through the virtual expo, I think, man, I wish we'd have had this in the 80s. This would have been so much nicer. Because you're almost like you're kind of virtually peeking into a room, and it's like, oh, there's a K9 LA. I haven't seen Carl in a while, and you go in, and all of a sudden, both of you are on the screen talking to each other. But I will pass this along to you as an extreme compliment. I can remember in 2020, and I'm trying to find the exact date. I guess it was perhaps 2021. The first one I did, it was called DX One Bite at a Time, and I was waiting to go on, and I think the problem was there were no credentials or something. So I'm calling Carl, K9 LA. And Carl's, if Carl can't figure it out, I don't have a chance. So, we're talking to Carl, and what he kept saying was, I've already talked to 2 other guys, and we really want to make this work for Eric. And I thought that was one of the best compliments that could have been paid, because it wasn't I have this presentation I want to do to see how many people listen, or I think I'm really good. It was like, no, it was all about, Eric's a good guy. He's busted his butt on this. What can we do to help? Let's figure this out. And quite honestly, we all made it. We all got through our presentations, and it was just it was a little glitchy at worst. That's the worst thing I would say. But I had sent you an email that following QSO Today, because you had this apology that you put on the podcast, and it was kind of like, well, yeah, I'm the one that hacked into the DXCC and screwed up everybody's records. I mean, you had the weight of the world on you, and I absolutely appreciated that. But I also tell you, there were a bunch of us out here saying, we got to make this right for Eric, man, because he's worked hard. We recognize that. This is a whole new frontier, and I still really applaud you for even taking on that challenge. So,
it was. I have to tell you, I said this to Rat Pack. I was on the Rat Pack this morning, and I'm an Orthodox Jew, so that means that I spend the Sabbath disconnected from everything for 25 hours. Well, the expo starts on the Sabbath here. Now, it's fortunate that I'm 12 hours ahead or 10 hours ahead of California, so I can actually come into my own expo. But it starts on its own. Now, I have Emanuela, who is my assistant in Milan, Italy, who is there. The VFairs team are amazing. They're in Dubai, they're in Pakistan, they're in India, the people that support me. Plus, there's a team in America. So I'm well covered in terms of all of the pieces. But that particular March 2021, that was so, I've never been under that kind of stress where every phone is ringing. As soon as I come down here, I mean, it's like, okay, let's see how it's going. And I come down here and everything is broken. And my wife sat next to me on a chair here, like making sure I was like on suicide watch because of the stress from it. And I realized that I had screwed it up. I'm a technologist first. I often, I love the features of things, but I sometimes don't think about the people that are affected by my love of technology. And so I wrote that apology because I felt badly that it had gone so badly. Now it was you, and it was Michelle Thompson, and it was Mike Walker from Flex, and everybody got in. I gave everybody credentials to get into the back end so that they could kind of sort it out while I wasn't there so that it could get launched. And I think in the end, 7,000 hams got on the platform and enjoyed and there was no end to problems in the presentation area. You couldn't find your presentation because it wasn't in alphabetical order, so we've done a lot of things now that have made it better. And that's mostly because I've spent a lot of the money that I've made on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on putting the money back in for programming. So almost all of the processes I do now are automated. If you submit an application to be a speaker, once I accept that application automatically builds the website. So it puts the speaker's picture up, it puts in all the links automatically. It sends a letter to the presenter that he's been accepted into the expo. These are the resources you use to load so other than the fact that we edit every presentation that's submitted before it goes up on the platform now, for the most part, we've got a lot of automation running to make a smooth expo, and I can pretty much run the whole thing up to the week before, and then the rest of the team comes in and helps me get through the weekend. And then once the weekend is over, essentially we're re-editing all of those videos so that if somebody decided to push the record button and have a conversation with the guy in the green room for a half an hour before it starts, that we can actually cut that off. But that's in essence, that's kind of what happens here now.
Wow.
It's a tremendous amount of work, even with just with the automation, but it ends up being such an amazing resource, I think, to amateur radio with the presentations and the quality. The quality is unbeatable. The people like you, Bill, and all the other people that put in presentations into the expo, they work hard on them. They spend a lot of time making sure that the content is good. I happen to think the Q&A that follows is the icing on the presentation cake, because the questions are good, they get answered well, and I think that's what makes those presentations so valuable.
So what happens to the presentations after the expo?
So all of the presentations, it's funny, most people don't go to the website. If they went to the website and they actually followed the menus around, they'd find all the presentations. But I felt so badly in March 2021 about what happened that as soon as my programmer got out of the hospital with a bag of drugs and he was back on the programming that week, we built a player for those videos that was also blind person compatible, so that and it's on our website. You can actually, if you go to the QSO Today HamExpo.com website, you'll actually find all of the old presentations. They're screen reader compatible. You can put into the search box any subject or any name or any title, and it will bring you to the videos those videos are playing from Vimeo. So all of those videos, once they're produced and re-edited, they go up on our Vimeo channel, and that Vimeo channel feeds that listing. And then I started deciding, well, maybe we should have a YouTube channel. I was kicked off YouTube a couple of years ago, but I got back on. So I'm trying to release those videos. The first videos from last September, are what's going up on the YouTube channel now. And so hopefully, they'll all be out in the public domain at some point. There's over 400 of them, so it's kind of, it's time. I have to pay Ben to do the editing. Ben edits the podcast, but he also edits the videos so that they're perfect. I'm a perfectionist, and when it comes to them. So as long as the QSO Today enterprise is running, I'll keep putting the videos back out there.
Great. I look forward to just browsing back. Oh yeah, I meant to watch that one, so I'll spin that up at lunch or whatever. So before you give us a little demo here, again, being a podcast, we may lose a few people, although we'll do our best to describe it. How can someone attend the next event?
Okay, so the best way to attend the event, or to get a ticket for the event. Oh, I might also point out before I say this, the expo is now available on a mobile app. So for Android and iPhone, so you can you can even participate in the presentations from the mobile app, and it works very well. And all you have to do is put in your email address, and it knows what event you're talking. So it's a VFairs. It's on the website. So it's a VFairs application. If you put in your email address, it knows what event to go to. So it knows what our event is. You have the ability to participate in all the presentations that are on the platform. You have the ability to talk, to message, or talk to, or video chat with any of the attendees or the participants in the expo on Expo Day. There's all kinds of social networking capability in the app that works with the people that are there. Unfortunately, the roundtables that I'll show you are not yet on the app. But they will be, hopefully next time we do this. But that's a big thing. Now, the way to get a ticket for the event is that the expo website is QSO Today Ham Expo.com, QSO Today Ham Expo.com. But if you go to the QSO Today Podcast website, there's also links to that website on the QSOtoday.com. Podcast, and I'm going to show you both pages so that you can actually see these resources that I've been talking about. So if you visually see them as well, then you'll know how to find them in the future. So if you go there and you push on "I want a ticket," register, then you'll go through a whole system for registration. And on the day of the expo, you only need your email address to get into the expo.
All right.
No password is required. If it asks for a password, it's because it thinks you're an administrator. So you won't need a password. Okay? Now, would you like me to share my screen and show you what I'm...
Yeah, please.
Okay, so
anyone that hasn't seen it, they'll see it.
Okay, so you have to enable the screen share for me.
You're right. Darn it. How about now?
Okay. So I think I'm going to go to the QSO Today Podcast first, because I wanted to show you were talking about how your audience can actually find the people that they want to. So if they go up to podcasts here and they go to QSO Today Podcast Archive and go all the way down, there's a downloadable podcast list. And Rachel, my assistant, keeps that list up to date. That list has the names and call signs, the date of the podcast, and the direct link to the podcast. So you can easily, with 440 hams, you might find that difficult, to find. So that's the easiest way to find, is to download this list. Otherwise, if you look up here, you see the search box. If we put in K3LR, then we can go to Tim's podcast or where he's been referenced in podcasts. And you also, by the way, you see K9CT. So that's the easiest way to find. Now, sometimes if they also have a transcript. So, for example, some of the listeners have paid for transcripts. So they fund the transcripts, and the transcripts are on the transcripts portion of the page. Now, not all of the podcasts are transcripts because we use human transcriptionists to make these transcriptions so that they're pretty much perfect. They get rid of the ahs and the other stuff, but we pay $1.25. Was it $1.25 a minute for transcription? So it's expensive, but if you want good stuff, you've got to pay for good stuff. Okay, so that's the QSO Today Podcast website. If you go to the homepage of the QSO Today Ham Expo.com, then let's see if I go to the homepage here. There we go. So I build a website. So if it's not beautiful and pretty and corporate looking, it's because I just know what I know, which isn't a lot. But this is the website. It tells you the hours of the website. Of the expo in both PDT and UDT. You click on this button to go to registration. I might point out that all the expos have had Rex Harper W1REX, and so while your audience are probably more advanced if they're DXers and stuff, there's a lot of hams that still like to build stuff, and they like to have live instruction while they're building. And so Rex is doing 2 more of these build-a-thons, and he's been in every expo since then. And you can actually click on this, go to Rex's website, get the kit before you start. Now, all the presentations are up at the top here. So if you go to presentations, you see it's loading sessions. This is the automation running. So it's pulling off another server. And so all of the presentations are here in alphabetical order. So if I click on Anthony Leslie Cage ZT's 10-meter band fun for all, if you click on the title, you'll actually go to more information about the presentation. When it's booked, the time. There's a system to add the data to your calendar so that you can. And then if there are specific presentations you want, put them on your calendar so you don't miss them. If there's a conflict between 2 things that you want to watch, choose one, and then you can always go back within the hour after and watch the one you missed. Plus a bio, and then of course there's a click here to register if you haven't registered yet. So there's these banner ads all around that are live to allow you to register. All of the speakers are listed, and I think I mentioned to you before we started that I asked the sponsors, that's Flex Radio, Bigali, PrepCom, to make presentations in the expo. Bruna Bigali, actually, here's Bruna's picture. Bruna is now running the Bigali Key Company for her father, who's now quite elderly. He'll show up at the expo in the lounge, but he doesn't travel anymore. So she's kind of the face of the Bigali Key Company. She's putting up a presentation about the history of the Key Company. And I think that people will find if they like Bigali keys, and I love Bigali keys because they're not only beautiful, but they're built like a warship. Very interestingly, the Bigali Key Company started. Pietro Bigali was making knitting machines, so he's an amazing mechanical engineer, and so his company has a long history of building mechanical technology, and his love of ham radio and Morse code led to Bigali keys. So she's also doing a presentation. But you can see we have a lot of presenters, over 50 presenters in this next expo. many of whom who've made significant contributions to the ham radio hobby, and I'm more than delighted. I'm honored that they've agreed to come into the expo. Now, if we go on the expo platform, I'll just kind of show you. In a way, this is last time's lobby. We're actually in the final throes of putting the new lobby together, but just to give you an idea of how this works is that all of these signs will take you directly to their booths. Their booths, for example, I think we'll go to Bigali's booth here. Let's see if that. Oh, they may not be in the. I keep playing with the back end, so let me just go to the Bigali. Okay, here we go. Here's Bigali keys. So this is what an exhibit booth looks like. Now this is a kiosk. So essentially, it allows you to download their content. So if they've got videos here, and they do, or documents, so you can actually download videos and documents from each of these vendors. There's not very many. There's only 6 this time, and you can also click and you can enter their table. So if you want to go directly to Bigali, to their lounge, you can actually go and join their table from the booths. And now we'll look at the tables. The last 2 times I used a product called Kumo Space, which was they look like real places. But what I found in the last expo was that people didn't like going from one space to the other. It seemed disconnecting. So we're back to tables, and the tables are all in one place. So this is the round table lounge. I have my administrator table where people can come and complain to me, or they can compliment it, whatever their feeling is. I'll take it either way. And then Flex Radio has their tables. And I just want to point out that you can mouse over the chairs. You see the chairs come out. If there's somebody sitting in the chair, like in this one, I'm sitting in this chair, it'll say who it is. And so you'll see their first name and call sign, on the chair, so you can see who's there. We have tables, Flex Radio, PrepCom, Bigali, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, Rat Pack. I've got 2 tables for speakers. Speakers can come back after their presentation. So if we run out of time on the room, so the room lasts an hour, people can come to the speakers tables and they can ask more questions of the speakers until they've had enough and they need to go and leave. And then I've got subject tables like Chewing the Rag, DX and Contesting. This would be your table, perhaps. HF Digital Modes, Youth and Ham Radio. The ARRL has a table. Actually, it looks like they've got 2 tables. And Bigali Key has a second table. And I'm not sure, there must be somebody in the back office playing with the order again, but I'll fix that. But that's how that works. And essentially, all you do is you click on it, and it opens a stream that looks like Zoom. It's not Zoom. It's actually a different engine. Every person on a table has the ability to do what I'm doing now: share their screen, make a presentation, have a conversation. It's a pretty cool operation, in my opinion. But the opinions that really matter are the people that will come to the expo in 2 weeks and tell me that they like the tables or they don't like the tables. But I think this is there'll be, by the way, there's only, I think, 15 tables here. There'll be about 60 tables. So there'll be a number of tables that are numbered that go down. So you can go look for an empty table if you want to have a conversation with a private conversation or a smaller conversation. You can go like you would at a live event. You go into a room full of tables and you see that there's nobody sitting at one of the tables. You go sit down with your friend and you have a conversation. So I'm hoping that will create opportunities for people to meet hams they haven't met before, to maybe find mentors, maybe to find students of ham radio, so that everyone can move their ham radio cheese further.
So what would I get in a virtual swag bag?
So the way the virtual swag bag works is that if you go to, let's go back to the exhibit hall. If I click on Bigali again. Okay. If I go down to her documents here and I say, oh, I think I want to put it in my swag bag. So Big Golly Keys flyer I put in the swag bag. There's some more things. Okay, I'm gathering here. If I go up to my swag bag, then I've got this stuff in here, and then I can actually apparently I can email these to me. So I can either I can view what's in the swag bag. So I can actually view the document. Or I can email it, and my email is already in the system. So just by pushing these buttons, I'll end up getting emails to my email address with these PDFs attached, and then you can decide to download them. So you can collect live documents from any of the players, and also I think in our roundtables, in the chat, there's a chat bar like we have here in Zoom. So that you can also put attachments and stuff like that. So if you wanted to share information with somebody, a schematic or something like that, then you can also share it around the roundtables.
Very cool. Yeah, and it's quite it's a little bit different than last year. So you're right. You continue to enhance it and develop it, and
it's all one platform. You know, the Kumo Space Lounges we used last time, you were actually leaving the VFairs platform to go to Kumo Space, and we actually had VFairs embed the Kumo Space in what's called an iframe on the platform itself, but it wasn't that smooth necessarily. And again, what I found was the first time we used it, people thought, "Wow, this is amazing," and it was amazing. But the second time around, it kind of seemed like, well, you know, the novelty is worn off. I didn't see as many people using it, and I didn't see people going between. We get reports for everything, so I actually will see, you know, if a user like you, Bill, is moving from one place to the other, I'll see a report that says, "Oh, Bill went to these tables or these Kumo Space Lounges." And when I saw in this last report, people weren't going from lounge to lounge. It seemed to me that perhaps its novelty had worn off. Now, there are some die-hard users, you know, like the Ham Radio Workbench guys. They'll sit in there all night long, you know, with their friends, and that was great. They can do that on their table and do the same thing here. So I think that's kind of how it's going to play this time.
Very cool. Well, best of luck, and I hope that turns out. I sure do.
Eric,
go ahead, Joe.
Eric, I'm quite impressed about this because I hate to admit this is all absolutely new to me. I just come from the old school, and this is very intriguing. I've never seen anything like this before, I have to admit. So I've got a couple questions. Are there many non-hams that will attend the convention?
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, one of the things I thought to do, I have 2 weeks to kind of, you know, get it together in terms of getting more word out. And usually that's kind of the way it works with all the conventions is that ticket sales are slow up to the last 2 weeks, and then they start to pick up. I think the conversation, that the panel discussion that we're having on balloons and amateur radio aeronautical mobile, because you know what is a balloon, an amateur balloon with a payload? It's an aeronautical mobile. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, you can't fly aeronautical mobile as a ham radio operator over the UK. So all of these balloons that are using APRS or something, they're geofenced. When they fly over the UK, they stop transmitting until they are no longer over the UK. And there's a whole database in these balloons, you know, to comply with wherever they're flying over. I think that I'm going to try to find other groups that are interested in aeronautical mobile, you know, as hobbyists, or they have an interest in weather balloons as hobbyists or whatever. In order to see if I can invite them as well, maybe expose them to amateur radio. You know, we'll see. The proof is in the pudding. We'll see how the pudding looks in 2 weeks when it plays. But I chose that as a panel discussion because it became relevant in the news, and I think that even a lot of hams don't realize what the extent is of amateur radio aeronautical mobile. Whether it used to be you could fly in a commercial jet and use your 2-meter handheld from the window. I remember doing that 40 years ago. You can't do that now. So, things change. And I think it would be interesting to know what the implications are of this newfound knowledge that the media and everyone else seems to have about balloons that they didn't have before, and what that implication is going to be on ham radio. So I'm hoping that that's a way to bring in perhaps non-hams. Otherwise, I use the channels that I know, and unfortunately, I don't know very many of the channels outside of ham radio that could attract people to that.
I have a follow-up question. Can you, in the convention, can you come and go like you would at a normal convention? You might sit in on a table or a conversation, and then you might leave the room and come back a half hour later. Is that
absolutely
okay?
No, but Joe. That's the beauty of this is that I know that that people have lives. So the way that this convention works, people go to church.
Sure.
In America, I think America still has the largest percentage of churchgoers of a population in the world. So Sunday morning we have presentations beginning at 8:00, but a lot of people have church. Well, you can come back after church and see those presentations. Now, you can't participate in them because they've already happened, but they're there, and they're there for 30 days. So your ticket allows you to not only participate on the 2 days of the convention, but for the 30 days that follow, all of the presentations that were made are still up on the platform in the auditorium on demand. I can actually, if you want, I can show you what that looks like real quick. Here, let's go to the auditorium. So this is what the listings look like. Now, there's no buttons yet, except to add to calendar. But you'll see there'll be a play button on the right-hand corner here. So you'll be able to go through these, or you'll be able to search for them up here if there's a subject that you want or a name that you want. So yes, you can come and go. If your spouse lets you, you can bring the mobile app along with you and your Bluetooth headset, and you can listen to a presentation and even participate in it while on the family picnic. I don't recommend that. Happy wife, happy life. So,
yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else, Joe?
No.
Okay.
No, interesting. Oh my God. Yes.
I kind of thought you'd get a hoot out of it. So
Yes. Yes.
So I'll put these in the show notes, but there's 2 sites that we've been talking about, QSOtoday.com. And I really encourage people go to look that up in their podcast app. As I said, the back catalog is fascinating to me. And I have gone back, I think I started somewhere around episode 150. And I instantly went back and listened to a lot of the other ones, and really some of them were incredibly informational. Some of them were very nostalgic. So either way, I got a hoot out of it. And then the other side.
You have to understand also, Bill, that when I started the podcast, I didn't know anything about podcasting. So I was using an operator headset for my microphone. So that's why the audio is a little thin, in the first 150 episodes. I think that when ICOM came on as a sponsor, I finally had enough cash from their sponsorship that allowed me to buy a $60 microphone and do a better job with the quality of the audio. But if you can stand the audio, those first sessions were also interesting. And they were people that I knew, at the time, because that's what you do. You find the people that you know as guests first, because you know you're going to break something and they'll be more forgiving. And then as you build up your confidence over time, then you start going after the big guys who will give you their time because they've actually heard about what you're doing and they think it's worthwhile. And I think that what you guys are doing it'll evolve the same way. You'll be very successful. The fact that you're doing video too, I think, is a real plus. That's an important factor. I'm not doing that yet. I'm an audio guy, but at some point, maybe the QSO Today podcast will become video.
Okay. Well, the second site that we'll put in the show notes, of course, is the QSO Today Ham Expo. People can go there for all the information they want. They can register. I encourage them to do that. I've been able to go back and look at previous stuff that other folks have done, and I didn't have time that particular day, but within 30 days, I learned something or gave me ideas to try something. So both of those avenues are just terrific. And boy, Eric, I was excited to have you on. I wasn't disappointed, so I appreciate you taking time to do this. Joe and I are just a couple of ham geeks in the Midwest, and you took some time from Israel to loop in with us. So we're both very appreciative. And once again, we learned a ton, and anything we can do to help you, we're always here for that. So
yeah.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on, Eric. It was nice to meet you. Very, very knowledgeable for me. Oh my God, I learned a lot this morning. So thank you for all that.
It's about time for your nap, isn't it, Joe?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks again, and I will put the information in the show notes. And Eric, maybe after this is a smashing success, we can loop back up, and I'll buy you a cup of coffee online, and we can compare notes at that point.
Well, maybe at some point I'll also be traveling to the States. I don't see it this time. I also do music, so I decided instead of going to Dayton this time, I'm actually producing a concert in Jerusalem the 30th of May. So I'm trying my hand at becoming a music promoter. So we'll see how that goes as well. But at some point, I'll see you in America, and we'll have coffee over a table.
Yes.
So are you familiar? Who's the rock group that's made up of ham, Joes? Is it the Harmonics, or they play at the they used to play down at the Crown, and
yeah.
Oh my God.
I know who you're talking about.
So maybe you could have them come over and produce a concert with them as well.
Yeah.
That would be very good.
That would be very interesting.
I have to tell you that we've had a lot of hams that have been guests on the QSO Today podcast come to Jerusalem. So and listeners. So it's nice to have people that listen to the podcast or have been in the podcast come to Jerusalem.
Very cool. Well, again, thank you so much. And we'll any feedback I get, I'll certainly pass along to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hey.
All right, thanks, Eric and Joe. Thanks, guys. How cool was that? I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of the DX Mentor. Thanks to our gurus on this podcast, Joe, WAGEX, and of course, Eric, 4Z1UG. And honestly, thanks to Eric for pushing the envelope and trying to bring us all together, especially during COVID when no one could join HamFest. That was really a lifesaver, so thank you. I'd love to have your feedback, answer your questions, and provide help with any DX or amateur radio issue that you may have. If you need clarification on something or you just have a question, please drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter using @thedxmentor as your handle. We also have a Facebook presence, The DX Mentor. Each episode can be listened to in podcast format. Just search for The DX Mentor on your favorite podcast app, and an episode schedule and more information can also be found at ajb.com/the-dx-mentor-podcast. Please drop me a note if you've achieved an all-time new one, received recognition, or have a DX event that you would like to mention. We would be happy to do that. 73s for this episode, and thanks to my XYL Karen for her love and support.